Friends, welcome again to Cultural Savage. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Bekah Rhea. A native of Knoxville, Tennessee, Bekah obtained her Master's of Divinity from Mercer's McAfee School of Theology, including a certificate in community transformation. She's been involved in mission work in Guatemala, Nicaragua, Cambodia, and throughout southeastern U.S. Her research interests have included contemplative spirituality and the arts, reframing theology of disability, and faith development across religious traditions. She is currently a freelance writer, editor, and dream interpretation coach based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. You can find her website in progress at bekalog.wordpress.com or check her out, Bekah C. Rhea, Beck C. Rhea, on Twitter. How are you doing today, Bekah?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. Thank you so much for coming on. Now, we met because you decided you wanted to be on a podcast, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you a little bit of your story, where you came from, how you got to where you are? Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee. I come from a big family. I'm one of 5 children. I was born with a disability called spastic diplegic cerebral palsy. So basically, I can do most things. It's just like walking and running and standing still, and those kinds of things that are a problem. But that's something that I've had my entire life. And so that's kind of a big part of my story, in that it's kind of affected how I see the world. My theory is that because I couldn't, be on the jungle gym or play kickball or what have you, I was constantly observing people.
Mm-hmm.
There was a distinct stage of my life, I think, where I carried around a notebook and just wrote everything down. My favorite book was Harriet the Spy, because she had a notebook where she did that.
Right.
And so that's what I would do as a kid. I would sit on the bench under the willow tree at the playground and just watch people. And I think that's part of why I've gotten into kind of observing everyday life and getting all of these degrees, because I've always been one to observe. And I grew up in a typical kind of conservative evangelical context.
Mm-hmm.
Was the good church girl for most of my time growing up. Thus all of those kind of mission trips and mission involvement that you mentioned in my bio. I was part of a puppet ministry for several years. So that's where a lot of my experience came from. But it was also kind of that experience that showed me, I guess you could say, the flaws in the system, particularly our missionary system and the white savior complex and the importance of cross-cultural communication. And so that's kind of how I got into ministries, that I looked at that and I said, there has to be a way to do this better. And so from there, I kind of set out on this journey. In college, I kind of had this idea that I would be kind of this missionary extraordinaire, going, out to the bush of such and such a country and doing this and doing that. My time I spent in Cambodia is actually kind of what transformed that for me, because what Cambodia taught me, it taught me many things, but the primary lesson was, you can't minister well if you cannot take care of yourself. Because Cambodia is a difficult place for a disabled person to live. There are many disabled people that live there, but obviously, it's not very accommodating. And so for me, it was realizing that, okay, if you're spending all of your energy on culture shock and just trying to figure out how the shower works, you're not able to be in a good place to minister well. And so that was when I decided, instead of being a missionary extraordinaire, I was going to go to seminary.
Okay.
And so here I am.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you for that rundown. You got a lot of stuff under your belt. That's awesome. You've got some great stories, I imagine. So I'm curious though. You said in your bio that you are interested and you've studied and researched contemplative spirituality and the arts. Is that right?
Yeah, I was a double major in college in theater arts and world religions. world religions for the obvious reason of I wanted to be a missionary. But
Right.
theater was something that I started doing when I was about 10 years old. At my home church, there's a couple that runs a Christian theater ministry called the Word Players.
Okay.
And so they were really instrumental in my interest in theater growing up. And so that's something I always kind of clung to. That was my thing because I couldn't play sports.
Right.
There were a lot of things I was not very good at, but I could do that, at least to some extent. And so that kind of became my thing. So even when I got to college, it was still my thing. And in my overachiever brain, I thought I might as well major in both of them.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah, and so what I kind of learned through that is that theater and religion have a lot more intersecting points than you would think, especially looking throughout church history. So that's always been kind of one of my research points. But my particular research in that area was from studying Thomas Merton.
Okay.
I took an entire class on Thomas Merton and really fell in love with his work. My primary research there was poetic experience and religious experience, because Thomas Merton saw those things as analogous.
Mm-hmm.
Because poetry is a result of kind of what happens when we come in contact with everyday life.
Right.
He'd say, like, a good poet will look at something and tell you how they feel about it. Or a bad poet would look at something and tell you how they feel about it. But a good poet would look at something and really see it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you are looking at a poem, you are also recreating your encounter with what they are seeing. And so the artist makes you an artist in that way. And the way that we experience God is that, you know, he speaks through the channels that we have.
Right.
And so he said, you know, if your spirit doesn't come alive as a result of what you encounter in everyday life, then you have no inner life.
Wow. Okay. I need to read more Merton. I like I've known this for years. I just haven't. That's wow. That's really cool. I do want to ask you, and forgive me if this is like the obvious question, but I am curious, your disability, how has that shaped not your experiences, like what you did, but how has that shaped your thoughts about spirituality? Like you said, you fell in love with Merton and this idea of like experiencing God, right? Like how has your disability shaped your experience of God?
So the way I like to put it is that, you know, a lot of people eventually in their faith journey come to that point where they're asking, how can a good God do X, Y, Z?
Right.
But for me, as a child with a disability, that was every day. Because the way that that church handles disability is really terrible. Right? You have random people praying over you or saying, you know, like, oh, it'll be better when you get to heaven. Like, you'll feel better when you're dead, you know?
Oh, thank you. Yes. Okay. I appreciate
that's exactly
that.
what I want to hear at 7 years old. And so, and you know, I would read the healing narratives in the Bible and say, well, that's not fair, right? Why don't I get a turn? And so I've kind of always had that inner battle going on, I think, from the beginning of my life. And once seminary had kind of given me these theological tools with my religious education to say, like, that's not necessarily the way it has to be, and that's not necessarily who God is, right?
Okay.
And so to be able to look at things like process theology, in that in process theology, you have in the primordial material of the world, there's just something that was wrong, right? And so it's not anything that was created, but it was pre-existing. Or you have protest theology, theodicy, which is inherently that, like, you are allowed to get mad at God for not doing things, because yes, he should be doing things.
Right.
And he will listen if we protest and cry out. And so there's so many different kind of theological options. So I always marvel at people who kind of encounter that question of how can bad things happen to good people, and then just kind of crumple, because you have so many choices, but people don't really know that.
Yeah. I mean, I got to say, like, my own experience has been with mental illness. and the joys of people responding to that. It's a spiritual problem. No, it's a brain problem. I got some issues. But honestly, I've never thought about these other theological narratives, like protest theology, like process theology, as an answer to theodicy. I genuinely haven't, and I wonder if that has to do with the fact that you've had to live with it, or do you think that's more like do you think it's your lived experience that helps you see that, or do you think it's more like your proclivity for research and things like that that help you sort of answer that question that way?
I think it was both, in the sense that what happens to a lot of disabled people is the disability community is very bitter, and rightfully so, because we've been dehumanized for centuries, right?
Right.
But a lot of disabled people, once they get kind of that treatment from the church, they just leave. And for me, I think because my faith was so instrumental growing up, that when I continued to face that problem, I just out of my relationship with God, I thought, well, it can't just like not be possible, right? There has to be some way for this to work.
Right.
And so I tried to resolve it through study. Most people try to resolve it by walking away for a while or walking away forever. But I was determined to say, like, there has to be another way. There has to be another way to make this work, at least enough in my brain for me to come to terms with it.
Right.
And I think it's because I handled it in that way. And I'm privileged for that. Also because of my background. My dad is a pediatrician, and my mother is a special education teacher.
Okay.
So when they had a daughter with cerebral palsy, and the doctor saying, well, she probably won't be able to do this and this and this and this, my parents are like, you don't know, or like if a doctor suggested a ridiculous surgery that would have put me out of school for years at a time, they were able to say, I don't know if that's necessarily medically necessary, right?
Right.
Because they had that insight. And so many people don't have that. Like, as an adult, now that I can go to doctors that are not my dad, I'm realizing a doctor can just tell you anything.
Yeah, no, they really can. They really can.
Yeah, and that's what happens to a lot of disabled people, especially as children. So there's research that shows, or that compares, like, parents who have disabled children going through those stages of grief that we all know so well.
Right.
The anger and the bargaining and things like that. And for my parents, I think those stages were a little bit shorter. Because there wasn't a lot of bargaining to be done, because they knew kind of scientifically what was going on and what reality was going to look like, right? But for a lot of children, their childhood is their parents going from doctor to doctor to doctor, trying to figure out how to fix their child.
Right.
And that's something that I never had to deal with. So it's a combination of my mindset, but also my privilege that put me in this position.
Wow. Way to own it. That's awesome. I want to shift gears a little bit, and I'm curious how you, not as a disabled person, but just as a person, how do you practice contemplative theology?
My favorite way to practice contemplative theology is probably like through art and artistic things.
Okay, say more about that. That's really
sure
fascinating.
Yeah, so my favorite is ceramics. My last few years of college, I took a pottery class and I fell in love with it, kind of as my way of meditation, because it allows you to kind of let go of your perfectionism. Because the clay becomes kind of what it wants to become. It's usually not ever what you thought it would turn out to be. And it was good for me just to have something to do with my hands. And so, whenever I would be working on my thesis and just didn't want to do it anymore, or had questions or whatever, I would just go to the studio and like make a bunch. I have boxes of pottery in my closet because I would just do my pottery and put my worship music on, and that was my contemplation. It wasn't until I think that I got to seminary that I kind of started to dabble in other spiritual practices. Like I mentioned in my bio, I do dream interpretation. I've taken courses on spiritual care through the interpretation of dreams. So not quite a Freudian interpretation, but looking at your dreams as a reflection of what is going on inside you. And my dreams have always been very vivid and very strange. And so the minute I heard that was the class, I saved a spot in my schedule for it. And so that's something for me that has also been a super useful tool.
Okay, that's cool. I'm curious, back to the pottery. Do you feel like that got you in touch with your body? That's why like it got you out of your head a little bit and got you more in touch with, like, I guess grounding you is the question. Is that why it was sort of the answer to thesis burnout?
I think it gave me something to do with my hands. I'm one of those people where I have to feel productive.
Okay.
And so I think to say like I may be procrastinating on my thesis, but at least I'm making a bowl, with something, and you can always kind of take out your hostility on the clay while you're working with it and things like that. And so having something to do with my hands, and also just to remember that something beautiful can come out of me, right? I think is really important.
Say more about that. Say more about that, please. That is a beautiful statement. I want to hear your thoughts on that.
I've always been a really self-critical person. I mean, growing up with a disability, I kind of, I don't know if you do the Enneagram, but I'm a type 4, right?
Oh, I am too.
Yeah, see, so it's the I'm the odd one out. Nobody likes me.
Right.
Have you ever seen the Disney movie Meet the Robinsons?
Yes, I love that movie.
Do you remember the part where little Goob is walking through the hallway at school and he's saying they all hated me, and all the kids are like, "Hey, want to come to my house? Nice binder."
Right.
That was me as a kid. I was like, they all hate me. They all think I'm weird because I'm crippled. But it was like, it probably wasn't that way. But so I've just always been kind of a self-critical person. In fact, the first day of ceramics class, I was like, gosh, I don't know if I'm going to be any good at this. Like, other art that I've tried to do, I've always been a perfectionist. And so if it doesn't turn out like it looks in my head, I get kind of upset. And so with pottery, it's so easy because with clay, you can make mistakes. And like you can make mistakes and add a little bit of water and change it if you need to, or like you can recycle the clay. So it wasn't like, oh, I'm wasting materials, I'm wasting my time if you made a mistake. And so that really helped me see like, wow, I really can do this. And so I think sometimes we forget, we're so busy being hard on ourselves about not being productive that we don't remind ourselves that we can make beautiful things, because the thing about capitalism is that we're rewarded for making things, right? But those aren't always beautiful things.
Yeah, that's true.
There's a saying from, I think, Frederick Buechner, who says like, creativity has value because God is the creator. And so that's something that I like hang on my wall, because people would say like, as a theater major, you're wasting your time. Right. Or if you're working in the ceramic studio and sit on your thesis, you're wasting your time, but you're not.
Wow. I like that idea of making something beautiful. How does that idea of making something beautiful connect you with the world around you?
So I think inherently, like Thomas Vernon would say, like art is also what happens when we kind of encounter everyday life. I'm also big on poetry. I've written poetry since I was a kid, and so that's something that I've always been into. And I always say that like poetry is just taking one thing and putting it under a microscope. Like it could be a
Mm.
fleck of dust in your window pane,
Mm-hmm.
or one note on the piano, or how the clay feels in your hands, but like you're just taking an everyday experience and putting it under a microscope.
Okay. So you're kind of taking the everyday experience and recycling it into something beautiful, as you filter it through your own experience and your own point of view. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much.
I like that. I like that. I tend to think of the external world as something that I need to um, participate in. Like I need to somehow give to the external world. I need to somehow enter into the external world, but you're talking about letting it enter you.
Hmm.
That's really cool. That's a paradigm shift for me. I like it. Um sorry, I'm distracted now because I'm thinking of this whole
No, you're
thing.
good. Yeah.
Um do you think that taking in the external world shapes the way you view spirituality, or does your spirituality view the way, or shape the way that you bring in the external world? Like how do those two things kind of coalesce or fight against each other or harmonize, or yeah, how do they play together?
I'd say it's more of playing together than one or the other. But to to kind of experience those things is in a way like we can't describe God, right? God is
Right.
indescribable, mysterium tremendum, what have you.
Right.
But we use the terms that we have. And so if you can look at a flower and the way that it waves in the wind and say that that's what God represents to you, or what spiritual experience feels like to you, then
Mm-hmm.
that's something, right? And so I think on one hand, it informs the way that I see the things around me, but it also kind of gives you some new ideas.
What do you mean?
Like if you're looking around and um, one thing, like there was one time where I noticed just going from inside to outside during the summertime and the
Mm-hmm.
way you feel the humidity wrap around your body. I was like, I don't know if there's a word for that, but that's like an interesting experience that you can kind of expunge in some way. And so
Yeah.
you get new ideas just from like things like seeing a child in the park, or there were theologians like Howard Thurman would talk to trees. And so it's that everyday life kind of gives you the chance to think of these other possibilities of what could be, and inform the way you see yourself spiritually.
Okay. So you think the ordinary also gives us language for the spiritual?
Absolutely.
What's some of your favorite language for the spiritual?
My favorite language for the spiritual would be, it's often in like private moments, but I usually say like the way that uh it feels when you hit just the right chord on the piano,
Mm.
where it's a new sound, or the sound when the sound resolves
Mm-hmm.
and it's satisfying mentally. Like that's spiritual to me. Or
Wow.
like when I'm working at something on the pottery wheel and I'm
Mm-hmm.
trimming it away, or shaping it, that's spiritual to me. um, because we kind of have this idea that spirituality has to be reading your Bible or meditating or what have you.
Right.
Um, And as someone who also struggles with, depression and anxiety and things, sometimes sitting there and meditating is not good for me because I will ruminate. And
Yeah.
so being able to do something like gardening or art or whatever your thing is and still say that's spiritual, I think is really important.
Do you think that things that are spiritual are inherently connecting us to the divine?
I think so. I think that the more that I study, the more I kind of become a mystic, and that you can find the
Yes.
divine, and yeah, you can find the divine
Yes.
in just about anything. My whole kind of theology hinges on the imago Dei and
Mm-hmm.
the image of God. And so being able to say like there is God in everything, right?
Right.
Because one, again, we don't know everything about God. So like who are we to say that God is not there in the clay, is not there in the paint, is not there in the piano?
Right.
Um, because if so, like what a boring God, right? People people get so caught up in this like, oh, God is my parent that's disappointed in me, or God has to be this way and thinks these things about women and war or whatever. And it's like, what a boring God if you have, I guess, confined that God to your image of him.
Wow, that is a great quote right there. What a boring God if you have confined God to your image of him. That is golden right there. That is worth the price of admission. So let's talk about the Imago Dei a little bit. Let me ask a question that keeps popping up for me when I think about Imago Dei, humanity, and disability.
Mm-hmm.
What is the Imago Dei? Because, like, growing up, I was always told that one of two things. I was told either the Imago Dei was literally the shape of the human, because every time that God showed up in a theophany, he would show up as the Son of Man or looking
Mm.
as if a man. So it was the shape of a human, or it was our will, like the fact that we can make choices. And neither of those sit well with me anymore. So I'd love to hear, like, what is the Imago Dei? You have to be definitive here. This is the answer once for all time.
Okay. Thomas Merton talks a lot about the the external self and the inner self.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he talks about in my class what we call his kind of it's either fifth in walnut or fourth in walnut, but he was standing at a street corner and looking around him, he could just see that everyone was shining with the most brightest light, and just that if everyone could see that they are just love. And so I think that Imago Dei is that inner self where when you come down to it, it's just this bright light of just love. Um, and it's also kind of indescribable in that it's something you have a reverence for, because I've seen it and I can tell you where I've seen it, but that may look different from where you've seen it. Because I know the first time, I guess, that I kind of experienced it for myself was one of those trips to Guatemala, where working at, they had a lot of donated clothing, and the families would come through the line of donated clothing and pick out this many pants and this many things, and
Right.
I was behind the table for the women's clothing. But so many of these mothers were so busy looking for clothing for their children, by the time they got to my table, I would say like, oh yeah, pick something for yourself. What size are you? And they would look at me like, and just in their eyes, you could see this, like, you had seen who they were, right? And not for their children and not for the fact that they were poor, but to be able to look into the eyes of those women and so that for me was kind of where I first saw the Imago Dei. And that's partly where my whole ministry journey began, because in my mind, like, I also was very heavily influenced by Shane Claiborne.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, what Shane Claiborne talks about in his work is often like, if we could just see that image of God in one another, things would be so much easier. And
Yeah.
so my life mission in a way is to just like help people see that in themselves and others.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I love that. I love the idea of the Imago Dei being the inner person. But let me ask you this: how does that differ from Gnosticism, which kind of says that, like, the external is what we need to shed to be spiritual beings? So how does your interpretation of Imago Dei not fall into Gnosticism, or does it fall into Gnosticism? Let's just either one is not a right or wrong answer. I'm just curious.
Yeah, so the division that Gnosticism makes is largely based on external is pretty physical, right? Like the physical body versus the internal spirit. But when we think of our external and internal, Thomas Merton talks about how our external is not like our body, but it's like the coping mechanisms that we've developed and the masks that we've developed to go about our regular lives. It's who we think that we are instead of who
Okay.
we really are. It's the ego, basically. Because for me, it's not divine to completely separate your body from your spirit, because
Right.
your body in its own way is divine and sacred. And that's another another issue a lot of people have with this modern, with our evangelical theology of
Yeah.
your body is bad, right? um
Right.
yeah, or that, and even like things like the concept of like, well, you won't be disabled in heaven. Okay, does that mean that like disability is bad and that my body is bad, right?
Right. Right.
um and that's not what people mean by it, but that's the implication there. And so
Yeah.
I think that's kind of where I would veer off from Gnosticism, is that our bodies are also sacred.
So the external internal is really about the projection of self versus the true self, and not about like my body and the inner man, like my charismatic roots tell me. Like, the inner man is what we exhort and build up, and the external man can fall away. But
Mm-hmm.
it's much more about, I love that you brought up like coping mechanisms, because my therapist and I talk about this stuff all the time, because I have my coping mechanisms, my babies, the things I hang on to. Now, with either Thomas Merton or you, either both, synthesize them, whatever. What happens to the external when the internal becomes bright like that? Like, does the external still have a function, or is it just something that we need to, like, that projection of self? Does it still have a function, or is it something that we need to kind of disperse so that we can live from our true self?
So I think that Thomas Merton will probably say it's something you have to disperse, but I think that it's often something that we have to acquire to kind of make our way through the world. And that's not usually through faults of our own, depending on the culture that you're living in. But in our, in American culture,
Mm-hmm.
there is some extent to which that external still matters.
Yeah.
And considering, so not to say that those things are bad, but they do not make up who you are. They are how you make your way in the world.
Right. Would you include things like little t trauma responses as part of that external?
Um, I think that may depend on the trauma response. My therapist, or previous therapist, would always say, like, if it's helping you, then that's okay. Like, I would be concerned, like, is this a bad coping mechanism? I feel like this is a negative coping mechanism. She said, well, is it helping you? I'd be like, I guess so. She'd be like, then it's okay. Like, you know,
Wow.
you're not actively harming anyone else, and it's helping you, so that's okay. And when it comes to trauma, that's like how our bodies have adapted, right? It's
Right.
something that my body taught itself to do to protect me. And it is my body still trying to protect me. It's just that it doesn't need to do that anymore.
Right, right.
And so being able to shift that from something, it's bad in that it's related to trauma, but also like the brain and the body are incredible and they're trying to protect you during that time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't have to necessarily throw it away, but
Okay.
kind of in a Buddhist way. You kind of say, well, thank you, body, for protecting me during that time, but I don't need this anymore. And that's something you kind of have to keep cultivating again and again, but
Right.
something that you can dismiss when it's no longer needed.
Okay. Okay. So I'm trying to formulate this thought, and it has to do with trauma and disability.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel you're living with disability, because it's familiar to you, it's what you've known your whole life? How do you feel like you're living with a disability has impacted the way you respond to, like, say, emotional trauma?
Yeah. And it often depends on kind of the situation.
Right, right.
But it does mean that in certain relationships, like my first year of seminary, for I guess about for the first 6 months, I had a roommate who was moderately emotionally abusive, right?
Eek.
And so like she was really good about doing that thing of like turning around on me and making it my fault. When someone
Mm,
does that to me because of who I am as a person, I just kind of accept it as, okay, it is my fault, I should have done better.
right,
But there are certain things where it's like, it's not your fault you couldn't take out the trash because you can't carry the trash and like physically
right.
get it into the dumpster, right? Things like that. So it does affect how I process things in that way. I think that I am quick to, you kind of always have to run kind of an ableism check. As in,
Right.
was what just happened to me ableist or not? Um, and that's not something I particularly had to do or was forced to recognize until I got to college, right? Until
Mm.
I became an adult and had to kind of, assert my own civil rights and realizing, oh, that's something that I really actually have to do, isn't it?
Wow.
Because I'm the adaptable, flexible person.
Right.
So I'll just say, oh yeah, I can do that. Even if I can do that means I can do that, but I'll be in pain for a while, right?
Right. Right.
Um, and so I think in the way that I process trauma is that it makes me harder on myself and my body, but then
Mm-hmm.
also that my body kind of literally processes trauma in a different way.
Mm.
Because my disability is neurological, right? The
Right.
signals between my brain and my legs just somewhere along the way get messed up.
Mm-hmm.
So in a traumatic, situation, I am more likely to tense up or
Okay.
tense up or have a muscle spasm, right?
Right.
Which is not good either. I'm more likely to tense up. I'm more likely to, there are certain kind of physical responses that my body has to trauma that I can't control, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
and so I think it affects it in that way. I think emotionally, I experience trauma and process trauma the way that most people do. It just
Right.
depending on the situation, right? If I were to be in a situation of physical abuse,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's harder for me to get up and run away.
Right.
Right. And so that's something when you're processing that situation where you have to be like, one, it's not your fault you didn't just run away because you literally can't.
Right.
But that's something you have to take into consideration along the way. And so
Yeah. You still have a fight or flight response, but you're just incapable of flight. So your body will still dump the adrenaline and you have to deal with that, but you don't have the outlet for it that other people might, simply because those signals, like you said, from brain to leg get messed up along the way.
Yep. Yeah. It's kind of like, oh, how would I put it? But yeah, I guess my physical reaction, what I've often discussed with my therapist is my physical reaction is to make myself smaller in those situations. Since I can't run away, I just make myself smaller and try my hardest not to bother anyone, or just be quiet and don't say anything, and so for me, that's kind of my reaction to things is making myself smaller. Depending on, I don't know if that would be different for another disabled person, because every disabled person's experience is different.
Right. I'm talking about your experience. I'm not I'm not asking you to speak for all disabled people, because that's just ridiculous.
It's a lot. There's some parts I think about being a disabled person are inherently traumatic, and not like severely, right? But I think in ways that still affect kind of maybe those brain pathways.
Okay.
Because there are things like sometimes when I am brave enough to ask for help and people like make too much of it, right? Or it becomes like a whole thing where it's like, I asked them where the elevator was. I didn't ask for this grand tour of this theater wherever I am now, but now they're like, well, take you down the back door, or if I say that I don't need something and it's okay, and that person insists that I do need something, and I just let them help, right? So there are certain things where, or a lot of disabled people have the issue of people asking them about like their personal medical history.
For anybody listening, don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that. I have not had that problem as much as a lot of my acquaintances have, but a lot of people, the one that I've gotten will be like, have you tried this place? Like as a kid, I think it was like Shriners Hospital. They'd be like, have you tried they come up to your parents and be like, have you tried Shriners Hospital? And now every time I see a Shriners Hospital commercial, I just shake my head.
That's like somebody asking me if I've used essential oils.
Yeah.
Like,
well, yeah, they'll ask me that too, right?
Oh.
Have you tried yoga?
You're like, okay, great.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, going back to that idea of making yourself small, do you think that you do that because an ableist society treats you as small?
I think I do that because ableist society makes me feel like an inconvenience.
Oh.
And so it's a combination of them making me small, but also me making myself small. Because I don't want to inconvenience anybody.
Right.
I think in my disabled brain, especially as a child, it was like, if I don't inconvenience anybody, then they won't get mad at me, right? Or people will like me, because that was again an Enneagram 4. My thing growing up was like I wanted people to like me.
Right.
Like in PE class, they have those little like scooter things that everybody loves. That you like get on your stomach and scoot across.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we would do like obstacle courses on those. And my PE teacher, for some reason, maybe it was proper pedagogy at the time, was like, you have to ask Rebecca before you can pass her in the obstacle course.
Wait.
And I'm 6 years old and I want friends, so like of course I'm gonna let people.
Right.
But for me, as someone who's kind of afraid of conflict,
Mm-hmm.
My making myself smaller is a way to not inconvenience people.
I feel that.
Yeah.
I make myself, I acquiesce and make myself small as well. It's probably a little bit of an Enneagram 4 thing as well, of just
Oh
kind of
yeah.
shrinking in. So let me ask this. You talk about living in an ableist society, and that's one thing. Does an ableist church make you feel like an inconvenience? Or how does ableist theology, I guess, how does ableist theology make you feel? I mean, other than pissed off, because that's how
Right.
it makes me feel.
Um, so for me, um, it's more, I guess, a sense of frustration. I think there are some circumstances in where you feel, as you should, you feel devalued, right?
Right.
Of like, if a church is built, especially recently, and does not have a ramp or an elevator, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not under one of the protected, right? And well, in churches, I don't think are necessarily under the ADA. There's a weird thing about churches and the ADA.
Yeah, churches
So
get exempt from everything that they shouldn't. Let's
yeah.
just say that.
So the thing is, like, churches that have those things usually have them because they have a lot of old people.
Right.
um, which brings you to the point of, like, everyone eventually becomes disabled in some way. But in any case, like, if I go to a church like that and there's no ramp, there's no way for me to get in the building per se. Like, there is the thought of, like, whoever built this has not been thinking about me, and whoever runs this hasn't been thinking about me because they're not building one, right? Um, but then on the flip side, you also have, I've been hearing now about a lot of churches that have specifically, like, ministries for children with special needs. Um, and I don't know how I feel about, because
Yeah.
there's a fine line between accommodating and treating as a service project, right?
Yeah.
And so every church is kind of different. And every person within the church is different, and so you never really know until you go. But sometimes, if I've done a lot of work in childcare at my home church and in other places, and a lot of times you see, like, the kid that is not neurotypical, people just don't know how to handle them, so
Yeah.
they put them in another class, or they get someone else to sit with them, or they put them in the class 3 years younger than them.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, like, what is that going to do later on to that child's perception of their self and church?
Right. Right. Yeah. One of my children is autistic, and we have been very fortunate. The program he was in ended up being a seed program for a preschool, and he went to a regular preschool, and he was treated normally and not infantized.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just trying to think, if that had happened to him, how I would feel as a parent. I can't even imagine how I would feel as the individual who it's happening to, especially as a child, because you're like, I guess this is how it has to be, because everybody tells me to eat my food at a time. Everybody tells me when it's time to go to the bathroom. And because you're a kid, so I guess this is how it has to be.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, never thought of
And
that.
when it comes to children's things, like, for me growing up, I was in a public elementary school for kindergarten, first grade, and fourth grade.
Mm-hmm.
And my elementary school was a great school, but they almost would kind of over accommodate, right? So they noticed that I'm sitting in my desk and my feet don't touch the floor. So they get me a shorter desk, which means my feet touch the floor, but I'm, a few feet lower than
Right.
all the desks around me. Or they gave me left-handed scissors, and I'm not left-handed.
Okay.
It's like, these are an accommodation, we think. Uh,
Wow.
and like that PE teacher saying, you have to ask before you can pass, Rebecca, or you get to pick one
Yeah.
friend to come with you on the elevator, and all of these things that are like, okay, they're accommodating, but also, and that's part of why I was only there for a few years. My parents decided to homeschool me because what was happening was the school wanted to take me out of class for certain periods of time to do occupational therapy.
Okay.
And my parents were saying, like, she doesn't need that. She needs to be in class, like, with the other kids, right? And so things like that, where it's like you have all these resources, but not every disabled kid is going to need all of those resources.
Right. No, that makes sense. So I want to ask you, in light of what we've talked about, in light of contemplative theology, of embodying your spirituality, of bringing in the outside world, and of disability, what does all of that do to shape your view of the gospel?
So I think the gospel is usually presented as, as we are bad, or are/we're bad, and God is good.
Right.
And so for me, I've had to, because I live in a world and also in a mindset myself that says I am inherently bad. I've spent my life trying to cultivate and remember that I'm not I am not inherently bad. Because for me that was a destructive mindset. And so it transformed my perception of the gospel in the way that, like, the gospel frees us to also take care of ourselves. A really transformative moment for me in ministry was when I was ministering to a friend, and then I realized what I was praying for, like, to end for that friend, was what I was doing to myself.
Wow.
And it's kind of this moment of like, okay, you're trying to save other people, but you also have to, be kind to yourself. And so I think that's what the gospel really transformed for me, and the idea that it's not just about the afterlife. Because, many churches kind of have that perception of like, well, if your body will fix itself when you get to heaven. It's like, so do I just wait until then? Like, what do I do? And so also understanding that it's more about not just going to heaven when you die, but living your life to the full, with the circumstances that God has given you. Yeah.
Wow. I like that caveat of you said living your life to the full, which everybody is all on board with these days because Athanasius said it. The glory of God is man fully alive, and because everybody's into wholehearted living, like Brene Brown and all that stuff. But I love that caveat that you gave it, in the circumstances God has given you. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we like to think that, I guess, all of our circumstances are from God, right? People like to say, God put me here for a reason, or this is happening for a reason. I, in my theological education, have formulated my theology as such where I don't necessarily believe everything happens for a reason.
That's good.
Right, because if I did, that would not be great. And so for me, it's God gives us our circumstances, sure, in some ways, but there are some things that are just the world that we live in, and it's not that God hates us and wants us to be miserable. But it is usually, when it comes down to things that you cannot control, it's your circumstances. And so to preach, live life to the full, to me, is different than to preach live life to the full to a homeless person, right? Or someone who is in poverty and struggling to simply live. And so it's living to the full in the sense of being your most fulfilled self. I believe it was Aristotle, but I'm not sure. I could be wrong. There's the concept of human flourishing,
Mm-hmm.
eudaimonia, and that's what I like to think of is like human flourishing, doing what you need to do to flourish as a human being.
Mm.
And that will change depending on what your circumstances are.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. I love the idea of human flourishing. I think it just reminds me of a garden. And in a garden you have various varieties of flowers, but even among those varieties of flowers you have different different patterns, different stem structures, different whatever, but they're all allowed to flourish. Wow, that's a beautiful picture.
And that's a great metaphor because if you also look at flowers and plants, they grow under different circumstances.
Mm.
You'd see like they bend, some of them bend towards the light. I worked in an urban garden not last summer. Maybe it was last summer. Time is nothing now, right?
Time doesn't mean anything. It's been
um,
50 years. We don't know.
yeah, I think it was last summer. And as I was weeding, I noticed that some of the plants had tendrils of the plant that had come out and had encircled the weed and were
Hmm.
basically trying to choke out this giant weed themselves,
Wow.
right? Plants are planted there and have to do and are
Hmm.
doing what they need to do to survive. And so I think that's a beautiful metaphor too.
That's great. Oh, well, Becca, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This has been a great conversation. This really has. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been fun.
Yeah. So anybody that wants to follow Becca, her blog again is beckalog.wordpress.com, or check her out at Bekah Rhea on Twitter. I will put those links in the show notes so you guys can click and follow. Again, Becca, thank you so much. You have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thanks so much.
All right, bye-bye.